Europe is facing one of its most consequential decisions since the war in Ukraine began. As EU leaders gather in Brussels, President Volodymyr Zelensky has issued a stark warning. Without urgent financial support, Ukraine may soon be forced to cut back critical military production. At the center of this debate lies 210 billion euros in frozen Russian assets, money that can help Ukraine survive the next phase of the war, but which also carries serious legal and political risks for Europe. Nearly 3 years after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the war has entered a pivotal stage. Military pressure remains intense. Ukraine's economy is heavily strained, and international aid, especially from the United States, has become more uncertain. EU officials say this summit could determine whether Ukraine enters the next year with financial stability or without it. President Volodymyr Zelensky told EU leaders that Ukraine is facing a €45 to €50 billion budget deficit next year. He warned that by spring, without fresh funding, Ukraine may be forced to reduce drone production, a critical part of its defense effort. Zelensky emphasized that Ukraine needs funding regardless of how peace talks unfold, to support an army if the war continues or to fund recovery if a settlement is reached. He described the use of frozen Russian assets as moral, fair, and legal, citing expert legal opinions. Since 2022, the EU has frozen about 210 billion euros in Russian central bank assets as part of sanctions imposed after the invasion. Crucially, most of this money is held by Euroclear, a Belgium-based financial services company. So far, the EU has only transferred the interest generated by these funds to Ukraine, not the principal itself. Now, the European Commission proposes a major shift. The European Commission wants to loan Ukraine around €90 billion over the next 2 years, using the frozen Russian assets as backing. This amount would cover roughly 2/3 of Ukraine's projected funding needs for 2026 and 2027. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the urgency is acute and vowed that leaders would not leave the summit without attempting to reach a solution. Supporters say this funding would keep Ukraine economically stable, strengthen its negotiating position, demonstrate long-term European commitment. Despite strong political support for Ukraine, EU countries are sharply divided over how far to go. Supporters, including Germany, Poland, and Finland, argue Russia should ultimately pay for the war. Ukraine must not be allowed to weaken financially. Legal frameworks exist to justify the move. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz said using the assets would send a clear signal that continuing the war is pointless for Moscow. But opposition remains strong. Belgium is under intense pressure. Because Euroclear holds most of the assets, Belgium could face serious legal and financial consequences if courts later rule against the decision. Prime Minister Bart de Wever told Parliament Belgium would only proceed if all EU members share the risk, warning that Belgium should not stand alone. He used a vivid metaphor, saying Europe must jump into the abyss together and hope the parachute holds. Adding to concerns, ratings agency Fitch placed Euroclear on negative watch, partly due to potential legal exposure. For the plan to pass, it requires approval from at least 15 EU member states representing 65% of the EU population. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán remains firmly opposed to further EU financial aid for Ukraine and has blocked alternative funding plans that require unanimous approval. Other countries, including Italy, Slovakia, Malta, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic, have also expressed reservations. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said she would only support the plan if the legal basis is completely solid, warning that a flawed move could hand Russia a strategic victory. Russia has reacted sharply. Moscow has filed a lawsuit in a Russian court against Euroclear, seeking the return of its frozen assets. The Kremlin has warned EU leaders not to use the money and has rejected proposals for a European-led multinational force in Ukraine. President Vladimir Putin has escalated rhetoric, accusing Europe of decline and openly insulting Ukraine's allies. The summit coincides with renewed diplomatic activity. Former U.S. President Donald Trump has said a peace deal is closer than ever. U.S. and Russian officials are expected to meet in Miami, with Ukrainian officials also traveling to the United States. Despite this, Zelensky insists Ukraine cannot wait on diplomacy alone. Funding is needed now. This decision could reshape international finance. If approved, It would mark one of the most significant uses of frozen state assets in modern history, potentially setting a precedent for future conflicts. If rejected, Ukraine could face serious financial strain within months, weakening its position militarily and diplomatically. EU officials stress that whatever happens, the risks must be shared, and the decision must be legally defensible. As EU leaders negotiate behind closed doors, the stakes could not be higher. This summit is not only about Ukraine's future, it is about Europe's willingness to shoulder risk, enforce accountability, and define its role in a war that continues to reshape the continent. We'll continue to follow developments from Brussels and bring you verified updates as they happen. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for fact-based international news.